Cool. So I'm Leor. I work in Imperial College for the last 9 years in the Center for Psychedelic Research. Started a lot with neuroscience and then research about therapy. But I've moved in the last 3 years to more look at like social dynamics with psychedelics. Actually, a bit more than 3 years ago, Morten examined my Viva, which was fun. Excellent examiner. You'll be happy to hear that I'm having my graduation ceremony only in 2 weeks. So, so the world was on pause for a while, right? So, been 3 years ago. So since then, I had like some tangent in my research and going to sociality, and I won't have a lot of neuroscience today in the talk. Maybe if I'll have some at the end of the talk, if I have some time, I'll actually show some brain blobs and networks and stuff. So sociality, anybody knows what does it mean? It's a kind of a niche term. A lot of evolutionary psychologists or evolutionary biologists used to like this term. And it's the idea that animals, humans, primates form into groups, right? And that's part of the evolutionary advantage of primates usually, but then humans perfected it, is to form into groups. So all primates do that. And as humans, we manage to perfect that ability and to create really large group. And this is usually done by our culture, right? So culture is the cycles or the movement between generations of stories, narratives, ideas, and technology. So this is kind of like one of the definitions of culture. And this is one of our probably what we advanced as human the most is culture and sociality. And there's a lot of things there because culture is also related to learning. And as we already saw, psychedelics change learning, but we'll get there. So a lot of psychedelic research starts like this, like usually clinical talks about psychedelics, they start by saying depression is on the rise, depression is an epidemic, it's all over, psychiatry is in crisis, there's no more good medicines for this, but psychedelics will save us. And maybe they'll help, save psychiatry, but what kind of a lot of times these talks miss is that the social-political reasons for the decline in mental health, right? So if there's a rise in depression, it's probably something in society that doesn't really function well. Some of the candidates are alienation, loneliness, lack of meaning, cultural poverty, and maybe the problem is not that psychiatry is in crisis, it's that society is in crisis. Right, so a lot of like psychiatrists and people from the mental health background kind of look at it, and this discourse is very familiar within mental health. I would like to say that I'm very much influenced by Bruce Alexander. Bruce Alexander is a psychiatrist from Vancouver who studied addiction, also very much influenced the work of Gabor Mate. And Bruce Alexander is known for his studies of the rat park. So a lot of people, there's famous studies about animals and addictions that animals, if you give them heroin or cocaine, they'll press the lever constantly until they are dying. You know, that's kind of the classic studies of addiction. And Bruce Alexander did the rat park experiments, which show that if you give rats the option to take cocaine in an enriched environment in which they have some like wheels and friends and other mice there, then they'll go to the lever, but much less frequently. So they go once in a while, they get their hit of whatever drug, but they're not getting addicted to that in the same way. And then Bruce Alexander will continue to study the same kind of point about addiction and the social component of addiction. Usually through this book is through historical accounts of addiction and how societies in decline, addiction is rising when societies are in decline. So he gives a lot of examples of how drugs which were part of a society, let's say opium in China, or let's say different substances that were kind of part of the culture and they were not addictive, became addictive once the society started changing and dislocating. So he studies Native Americans in Canada, and he saw that the addiction of Native Americans is also related to dislocation from their tradition. What's his claim as well is that capitalism, while usually this phenomena is seen in societies in decline, it's also seen more in capitalism, even when it's flourishing, because capitalism is breaking also the social bonds. So it's like a very social political idea behind the reasons for addiction. And I like to say that like this is part of my motivation as well. And part of my motivation is also my own personal experiences with psychedelics. A lot of times with they're social, they're with friends, they're fun, or they're socially meaningful if it's in a ritual. And I felt that this is not communicated in the discourse of psychedelics. So a lot of times, you know, this is kind of portrayed as the what is psychedelic therapy with eye mask and music, very isolated, speaking about inner healer, personal therapy, but not necessarily very much relating to the relational and social components of psychedelic use. This is very far from how psychedelics were perceived, you know, not so long ago. Joe Cocker and Woodstock, you know, really rocking it, revolutionary, social-political change, anti-establishment. So there's another cultural and social component to psychedelic use that sometimes is not in the current discourse of mainstreaming. So the talk will cover and is kind of dedicated to that component, to the social component, and the talk will cover connectedness. It will cover psychedelics and interpersonal relations, psychedelics and groups, psychedelics and culture, and psychedelics and revolutions. If I'll have time, I'll also do some psychedelics, some sociality and neuroscience. But it's important to kind of always keep that in mind when we speak about psychedelics, that there's hard to really say what is inherently psychedelic. Because it's always context dependent, or at least a lot of the research shows that. So when we look at like psychedelic therapy, the long-term outcomes a lot of times are related to the experience, to the state, but that experience is influenced by the environment, by the dose, by the traits of the people, by the pre-state, and all of these lead to certain experience, which leads also to outcomes. So it's really hard to say psychedelics do this or that. And we can say that maybe they enhance the influence of environment, of context. Maybe they enhance meaning, something that might be inherent in them, but they're not therapeutically inherent, or they're not even social connectedly inherent, as if I'll show in the talk. It's always in relation to context. So the first to kind of zoom in on where we see relationality and connection with psychedelics is actually in the experience itself. And if you look at different components of the psychedelic experience, you can actually see that and realize that there is a component of connection in them. So in the mystical type experience, or the unitive experience, or the kind of ego dissolution, but the positive kind of ego dissolution, this merging of self and other, there's a component of connection. So when people speak about the unitive experience, they speak about interconnectedness, about feeling connected to some maybe humanity, the world, or maybe just the people around them. The experience of awe also have this component of connection. Emotional breakthrough, so this is a cathartic release that's seen a lot in psychedelic therapy. A lot of times it's actually when people think about their relations to other people and realize different insights about the relations to other people, and that sometimes bring this kind of emotional catharsis. Communitas is a group experience that I'll kind of go back into in a few slides, but it's the experience of group harmony and connection. Entity encounter, a very common experience with DMT. People and some people explain it as like our innate social manifestations of entity and then our relation to those entities. So it's like almost a social hallucination, entity encounter. And animism, animism is the idea that there is a spirit in living things, so spirits in the trees or spirit in nature. And a lot of times when people take psychedelics in nature, they actually feel that the tree is breathing, the nature is alive, and they feel connected to that. So it's kind of, they socialize the nature in the experience, and then they build a connection with it. But just also to mention that a lot of like these are like kind of positive experiences, but a lot of times there's social negative components. So paranoia, alienation, separation, these can also happen with psychedelics. So again, this is a context-dependent matter. So the idea of connectedness is very kind of seen in many qualitative research with psychedelics. It's seen in ayahuasca for substance dependence. Roz Watts, or lead clinical therapist from the depression trial, saw this as one of the key components of healing for people in our depression trial, so people felt more connected. Alex Belser saw it with psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety. Nurani saw it with psilocybin for smoking cessation, ayahuasca for addiction, and in ayahuasca retreats, and in psilocybin group therapy as well in UCSF. And all of those qualitative research reveal this component of connectedness as something that's important. So together with Roz Watts, we have this paper that's not published yet, and I co-authored this with her, and we kind of created the connectedness scale, the Watts connectedness scale, and we saw that people describe connectedness to self, which is emotions and body, connectedness to other, which is family, community, and connectedness to the world, which is connected to humanity, to nature, to something kind of bigger. And we see that for many people in just natural observational study, so a large sample, we see that many people show a significant increase in connectedness in 2 weeks, in 4 weeks, and also up to 6 months. We see those increases for all of those connections to self, to others, and to the world. We see also that this experience, the change in connectedness is mediated by the experience itself. So people who had more mystical type experiences during those, this is from a ceremony study, so during those retreats and ceremony, also had higher increases in connectedness, also emotional breakthrough predicted increases in connectedness, and communitas, so the kind of group harmony in the ceremonies. Now we took this measure and we took it to our clinical trials, and we measured that compared to escitalopram, and this is our the same trial that was published in New England Journal of Medicine, and we see here that escitalopram does not increase connectedness, while psilocybin does increase connectedness. So while both can be antidepressants, psilocybin seems to work differently on the long term. So these are long-term changes on the long term of how it is clinically beneficial. And we think that connectedness might be one of those key differences between psilocybin and escitalopram. Slow me down if I ever speak too fast, because there's a lot of information here. So I'm going to move into kind of different realms of like where we see sociality, where we see this kind of psychedelics and relations, increases in relations or group formation. So we start by kind of self, person, and then interpersonal, and then group and culture, and so on. So in the personality, we see that there are different components that change in personality: pro-social, openness, social connectedness. There are many studies actually that show this. This is a meta-analysis that was published this year of 21 papers from the last 2 decades, showing these pro-social or social changes from psychedelics. So some of those papers showed increased altruism, higher social functioning, better relationship with family and friends, and increased empathy. But just always good to remember that these, most of them in a therapeutic setting, in contexts which are maybe not ideal, this is not necessarily what's going to happen. I'm not saying anything inherent to psychedelics, right? Context is crucial. And this is one example of this. In the same paper, they go back to a study from the 60s in autism spectrum disorder. And they kind of, in that study, they wanted to use these like pro-social or social connectedness aspects of LSD to treat autism spectrum disorder, which was usually good, and usually the improvements like was for most of the population. But for some of the patients, actually, there was worsening of the symptoms, including aggressive behavior, including suicidal behavior, and suicidal ideation. And then the researcher at the time said that it's related to the interpersonal relations with the experimenters. So the quote here is, "Greater improvements were observed when the therapist was more actively involved with the children, when they were given the possibility to experience meaningful interpersonal psychotherapeutic interactions, and when the setting were free of artificial or experimental restrictions." So if there's no healthy interpersonal interactions, then actually there's a risk in the psychedelic experience. Okay, so it needs a safe, trustworthy kind of relations to guide the experience itself. So studies kind of looking at interpersonal stuff between people kind of speak about increases in love, in the Therapeutic Alliance, in empathy, in closeness to other and trust, and also a few studies show increases in oxytocin under LSD. So, for example, Dolder from the Swiss group shows that under LSD on a high dose of 200 micrograms, there's increase in openness, increase in trust, increase in I want to be with other people, and feeling close to others. So this is even an experimental study. In the same trial, they looked at empathy, and they showed people photographs of people in emotionally charged situations, and they measured empathy, and they saw that with the high dose of LSD, emotional empathy increased. Okay, so just the reaction to the photos. Now, the Therapeutic Alliance is also considered the crucial element of any therapy, but also of course, very much important in psychedelic therapy. So this is the report, the connection with the therapist. One interesting study of this in the 60s, the study of HYDE. HYDE did a study in a hospital, and they manipulated a lot of different things that relates to the context. So they did a whole year in which the relationship with the experimenters was very cold and dry, and not empathetical, and a lot of requirements from the experiment. And then did another year of the trial in which there's a warmer interpersonal relationship with the patients. And they saw that the supportive environment also had, people had better experiences, but also less risk, less anxiety. So the impersonal environment can create more anxiety with the psychedelic experience. So again, from our New England of Journal Medicine, so from the same trial, we looked at the Therapeutic Alliance. This is also accepted but not published yet. Roberta Murphy, who is a therapist in this trial, she looked at the Therapeutic Alliance and how it's related to clinical outcomes. So we see here that the Therapeutic Alliance, again, the connection with the therapist, and predicts the report. It's pretty much a similar measure, but in different time point. And that predicts the intensity of the experience of emotional breakthrough, of the emotional release in the therapy. And that emotional breakthrough predicts the clinical outcomes, so the reduction in depression. So we see here again, this kind of in this nice model, how the rapport, the relationship with therapist is crucial for the process of psychedelic therapy. Also, people who had stronger emotional breakthrough also had increased in the Therapeutic Alliance. So sharing intense experiences together creates a stronger bond with the therapist also. So reduces the depression and also increases the bond with the therapists. This is on the interpersonal realm. Now we move to groups, and this is kind of the maybe classical example of doing a ritual together in groups, but also there are festivals and raves and group therapy. And generally, the recreational use of psychedelics is a lot of times social. There's something that just using them for fun, which can be a good thing as well, is a lot of times social and a lot of times very meaningful for people. So I'd actually think that the pleasurable aspect of psychedelics is crucial for why people want to use them. We can talk about them as being therapeutic and being we need to deal with challenges. But in the end, a lot of people use them because they also like the bliss and the pleasurable aspect of them. And in a situation like this is a social aspect. So in group therapy, this is a review of 27 papers from the 50s and 60s of group therapy. And approximately 700 participants went through LSD group therapy. This review doesn't have any concrete conclusions, mainly because there's no concrete measures that were used across studies. They pretty much concluded it was safe, but they do present few studies from the 50s and 60s that say that LSD enhanced the kind of group relationship and allowed the kind of the group dynamics to be an important part of personal therapeutic processes for people. So in the same with the same direction, we looked at the concept called Communitas. So Communitas is a concept from anthropology, from Victor and Edith Turner. And they studied rituals in Africa and then in different places in the world. And they show that a lot of times the ritual is in order to reach this kind of group experience. So these are not psychedelic rituals. And what happens that in rituals, the ritual has its own rules, its own social rules. And when a group goes to a ritual together, there is a liminal state in which the regular social dynamics collapse. At least that's what they claim. And then there's a strong experience of togetherness in the group. So that's kind of described as moving from social structure to anti-structure. But that anti-structure, this togetherness, is experienced as a collective joy, as a togetherness, as a solidarity as well. So they describe that this experience can happen in many liminal situations of in-betweenness. This can be in natural disasters as well. This can be in revolutions, in festivals. So if you maybe think about your own situations like this, usually people describe it as there was magic in the air. So you're in a festival and something else is happening and people relate to each other in a different way. And a lot of time people use there was magic in the air, there was a vibration in the air between us. So that's Communitas. So we measured this with questions like, I felt that social status became relevant. I experienced all participants as equal based on a basic shared humanity. I felt a sense of sharing with other participants. I felt a sense of harmony with others. And this is the kind of the data we have from our ceremony studies. So for people that are going into retreats and rituals. And again, we do this kind of process-oriented analysis. So in the middle, we see this kind of increase in Communitas due to mainly psilocybin and ayahuasca. And we see this increase in Communitas that predicts the kind of group and that retreat Communitas and the self-disclosure. So people who had more of this experience were also more willing to talk about their own personal emotions in the integration sessions after. So there was like more, they created more bonding, and that led also for long-term changes in well-being and in social connectedness. You can also note here that report, like in therapy, the relationship with the facilitators was also mediating this experience. Okay, so what's called the container, the trust in the people around you also helps these experiences to happen. Another example of this is the setting questionnaire for for the ayahuasca experience, and they developed this questionnaire with more than 2,000 participants in their trial, so observational trial, and they have those components in the questionnaire: leadership, decoration, infrastructure, comfort, instruction, and social. And then they looked at different ayahuasca settings. So Santo Daime and UDV are ayahuasca churches, and your shamanic setting is Western kind of ayahuasca use. And they show that in all of those settings, those components lead to stronger experiences and also to better outcomes and well-being. So things like the social component and the leadership, but also just the comfort in the ritual allows these certain experiences to happen. So we saw it in therapy, we see it in rituals, and now we move to raves, and we see that as well. So Martha Newson, she actually was in Oxford, a PhD of Harvey Whitehouse in cognitive anthropology, and now she's in Kent. And she studied identity fusion, which is very much a concept that Harvey Whitehouse is studying. And they showed that when people take drugs and dance, so usually most of them psychedelics, in a rave or free parties, that can lead to social bonding between fellow ravers. But that social bonding is mediated by the experience of awe. So sharing these like transformative experience on the dance floor with others also leads to this stronger social bonding. They also show that that bonding is also related to pro-social behavior. So they actually measured how much people are willing to give to a rave charity. And they showed that people who were had more of a transformative experiences on the dance floor, more social bonding, were also had a pro-social behavior. So donated more to a rave charity, but not to a universal charity. So it was rave specific, okay? So it's like your in-group, right? It's the people that you share the experience with, not necessarily everybody. And moving to festivals, Forstmann looked at 6 large festivals. Again, a very large study published in PNAS. And psychedelic use, again, leads to, again, you see those like process-oriented studies. Psychedelic use leads to transformative experiences, which relates to also social connectedness, and that's also leads to a positive mood in the end. So with that idea and that kind of notion, also this understanding, I also did an observational study of Israelis and Palestinians who drink ayahuasca together. And most of my research actually is directed right now to this study. What I'm showing now is an observational study I already did, but there are a few more studies planned. So we interviewed Israelis and Palestinians who drink ayahuasca together. I also had participatory observation. So I went to those ceremonies. All of them happen in the underground. They're organized by Israelis, and there's a Palestinian minority in them. So I could give a whole talk, obviously, about this, but I'm going to shorten it here. These are not peace rituals. They're just regular ayahuasca rituals for psycho-spiritual intentions, but there's like an underlying kind of intention, collective intention in those rituals for like oneness and human connection and as well peace. But the main reason that people go there is just their own personal kind of psycho-spiritual growth. These are not retreats, so these are regular practice that happens on a regular basis. So communities are formed around them. It can be going to drink together every few months or once a year, but actually the people who participate in this also go to just develop friendships beyond just going to the ritual together. And there's a participatory practice, which means that not only the shaman sings for the participants, but also people that can bring their own music and prayers to the ceremony. Usually like after half of the ceremony, people share their own music and their own prayers. And that allows like also this kind of intercultural and interpersonal flow through music. So we found three themes in this study. One is this kind of theme of oneness, and I'll kind of spread those themes during my talk. So for example, this was like an obvious experience that people had. This is kind of the experience of Communitas. For example, there were moments of love and open-heartedness that we're all together. There is no, you are Jewish, Arab, Muslim, Christian. Everything was stripped. All this nonsense was out, and only acceptance and love were present. This is kind of an experience of identity dissolution, human-human connection, social hierarchy collapses, communitas. This is a beautiful experience for many, and it's maybe an experience that also creates the kind of initial bonds that are required between enemies. But also good to remember that the conflict in Israel is asymmetrical conflict, is Israelis that occupy Palestinians. It's not just about becoming friends. There's also another cultural and political exchange that needs to happen if psychedelics are used for peace, you know, this idea. So I believe that this oneness and communitas are beautiful and important, but they're not the only thing. There are other things that need to happen as well. So in peace research, researcher actually call this, that there's a problem, they call it the irony in harmony, which means that actually creating kind of a harmony in small groups in asymmetrical conflict, in conflict in which there is inequality and injustice, actually can prevent change of reality because it creates a kind of illusion of equality. And I have a lot to say about this in different papers, but it's just a tangent here. So moving to culture, a lot of anthropologists, psychedelic anthropologists, speak about the importance of cultural setting and cultural priors, the importance of music and art, and I'll kind of go through this. So, for example, you can see here in the hospital, the quotes start actually the it has transformed the entire hospital because the whole atmosphere about LSD. It has transformed the entire hospital. Sorry, I'll pause for a moment. This is a quote by Sanderson in 1959. And this is a conference about psychedelic therapy. If you're interested in the history of psychedelic therapy, it's quite cool to read those transactions because it's just like conversations between psychedelic therapists, and there's a lot of like openness of ideas over there. A lot of them are actually seen also today in the psychedelic renaissance. So LSD has transformed the entire hospital because the whole atmosphere engendered by LSD is spread throughout the hospital and in fact forms an essential part of hospital culture. If LSD is given in a large institutional setting, treatment will be ineffective unless this transformation has occurred. Okay, and we can see also now with psychedelic clinics, a lot of times it's about designing the environment. We don't want them to happen in the regular hospital settings. So the hospital needs to change. There's a change of the hospital culture as well of how to treat patients, how to relate to patients. So psychedelics in other cultures and in ours as well, a lot of times are used also with the idea of like a cultural revitalization. So if you see how peyote was used from 120 years ago until the formation of the Native American Church, we see that there's a lot of cultural elements in the practice. So peyote was a small practice in Central America, but then it starts spreading across North America 120 years ago. A lot of times the idea was to bring people back to the tribe from acculturation or from kind of cultural poverty, from the kind of challenges that happens through colonialism. So there's a very anti-colonial sentiment in peyote, at least in the beginning. But they kind of, what they did is also create a ceremony, a ritual, music, and all of that was part of how they treated also healing for people who were kind of suffered from colonization. So the idea of also the Native American Church, if we said that Native Americans suffered a lot from addiction of alcoholism, the Native American Church not just treated them themselves with psychedelics, but also with music, with ritual, with community, and all of these were important part of treatment of addiction that was formed by Native Americans. So beside the kind of those cultural elements, a lot of researchers discussed the kind of how cultural priors affect the experience itself. Weston LaBerre, who studied peyote cults already in 1938, was already kind of saw how visions, hallucinations are related to kind of cultural input. Anthony Wallace, who also kind of claimed that we need to look at cultural setting and actually said that we should do cultural control trial. So like we do placebo control trials, we can do trials in which we manipulate culture elements between conditions. Marlene Dobkin de Rios, studying ayahuasca, also talked about kind of the cultural visions, how they're affected. Obviously, if you go to drink ayahuasca in a Santo Daime church with a lot of Christian background, people will have more visions of Jesus and Maria. But while you go to the scanner in Imperial College, you have more ego dissolution. And, you know, there's a lot of cultural priors that happen that lead to certain experiences. So Ido Hartogzon showed that in American trips studying the 50s and 60s, kind of the psychedelic research, and showing that studies that were like psychotomimetic, so kind of trying to study psychosis through LSD, were actually creating psychotic episodes for people, while studies that were psychedelic, they created mystical experiences for people. David Dupuy also studied the same kind of idea, called it the socialization of hallucinations. And in a retreat addiction treatment center called Takiwasi, he showed that the kind of framework, the ontological framework of the retreat is to treat through exorcism. So they see illness as a possession of the spirits, and ayahuasca helps people to exorcise those spirits, and they actually see those spirits come out of their body. So this is another kind of to make this point, which is also was obvious for lots of psychedelic therapists. This is from the same conference Transactions by Hartman. In our group, for instance, which consists of 2 Freudians and 2 Jungians, the latter will get a transcendental experience in the patient much faster than the former. The 2 Freudians, on the other hand, will evoke the patient's childhood memories much more quickly than the 2 Jungians in the group. So we see that a lot of times the framework of the therapy feeds into the patients, and then it feeds back into the therapist, because the therapists see that in the patients. So if a therapist worked with some modality, that modality would lead to certain experiences, and then suddenly the patient the therapist would start believing that, let's say, psychedelics are about bringing childhood memories, all right, and bringing repressed memories. But it's a lot about this intention and the framework in which they're used. Clear? Yeah, any questions? A lot of information. But I hope it all ties to this kind of idea of social component of psychedelic use. With that kind of Israeli-Palestinian context, we actually saw that although people had these experiences of identity dissolution and oneness, there were also experience of connection to the other through music and prayers. A lot of times there was very meaningful, awe-inspiring moments of intercultural connection. So this is an Israeli person saying. Almost every retreat, there's a moment in which they, speaking about a small group of Palestinians, are comfortable enough to sing in Arabic. This is always an amazing moment. Suddenly you hear your most hated language by far, maybe the only language in the world that you really didn't like, and suddenly it sends you to light and love. Okay, so the idea here and what people speak about is that the ayahuasca allowed them to kind of relax their own narratives and ethos and identity, and that allowed them more openness to connect to the other culture. So it's known that groups that live in intractable conflict develop this kind of rigid, maybe expectations in the world, if we want to speak about like in the terms of plasticity or and things like this. So we can also think about it neuroscientifically. If you live in a intractable conflict, you develop this kind of rigid expectations of who is the other, what is your narrative, and the plasticity induced by psychedelics can allow the connection to the other in the retreat. So a lot of times people talk about expansion in this moment. They feel expanded. They feel that the group is expanded in the moment. People move from their own personal healing into something unique that happened in the group, which also relates to larger reality. So, but it's kind of good to remember Nicholas Langlitz, who's a psychedelic philosopher, anthropologist, brilliant guy, did some studies in the past about the Zurich lab. So he did an ethnography of scientists. So he studies scientists in his ethnographical work. So the psychedelic scientist. And in a recent paper, he speaks about kind of the idea of psychedelics for moral psychopharmacology. And it just reminds us that while members of the American counterculture used LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin as psychopharmacological tools to liberate individuals from the ills of their society, Huichol youth ingested peyote buttons to become full members of their own society, and Native American church worshippers consumed peyote to foster indigenous resistance to North American colonialism. In the 60s, psychedelics were taken to experience a mystical union that users claimed foster a sense of universal love, but anthropologists have also described Amazonian societies that use them in rituals to prepare for violent intergroup conflict. In all of these examples, actually, we see that LSD, whether it is brings a group together, whether this group is a counterculture group like LSD, or whether this group is trying to form into a society like the Huichol example. But the psychedelic use kind of brings a group together through a shared practice. Now we move into a revolutionary, and there's a revolutionary history with psychedelics. For some reason, LSD is the kind of the obvious one, but peyote and ayahuasca also have some kind of in their history, some of that. A cool example is actually by HYDE, so the same guy who manipulated the context in the hospital. And another manipulation he did was looking at individuals taking LSD just with an experimenter or a group taking together. And he says, and this is not therapy, so he's like a very of experimenters with like a very scientific kind of context. Group subjects tended to be friendly to co-subjects and hostile to the experimenters, whereas the individual subjects seemed positive toward and dependent upon the experimental staff. The group subject seemed to utilize his own co-subject as a substitute source of support. The group tended to become a somewhat deviant subculture within norms of behavior particular to itself and negative attitude towards non-psychotic outsiders. So kind of a very anti-establishment. This is before, you know, the rupture, the psychedelic LSD revolution, but he kind of sees maybe a precursor to that, in a context in which there's a clear hierarchical dynamic with the experimenter, and relying on the experimenter for the kind of the safety, then there's a good relationship. But in groups which can support each other, and the experimenter just wants to take data from them, they actually create a deviant subculture and oppose the kind of establishment represented by the experimenter. Same kind of anti-colonial history is kind of resistance, revolutionary history can be found in peyote cults. I actually mentioned it before, but peyote has been used in many times with anti-colonial sentiments. Actually, the tipi, that is a very kind of famous symbol of rituals right now. It's a good anecdote is that a lot of rituals, not just the peyote rituals, were outside. So Native American rituals were outside, but then they were banned, not just the peyote rituals, they were banned by their colonizers. And then they started to move the ritual into the tipi in order to hide actually the ritual. So the tipi is almost like in the beginning was a place that's related to their oppression and the need to hide their religious practice. Ayahuasca has also these sentiments of anti-colonial resistance sentiments. If you don't know, ayahuasca was in very few places in the Amazon until 150 years ago. 150 years ago was or at least, less, 120 years ago, was the rubber boom, in which a lot of atrocities happened to indigenous people in the Amazon. So in that very intense political period, this is also when ayahuasca spread between tribes in the Amazon. It was used for healing from colonialism, but it also had this kind of anti-colonial sentiment and kind of creation of indigenous unity through the practice. And LSD also has this kind of hippie, turn on, tune in, drop out, anti-establishment background. So I saw this also in the Israeli-Palestinian project. So again, observational research. And we saw that sometimes there were revelations or moments of insights or visions that relate to collective trauma, mainly the collective trauma of Palestinians. These can be insights of war, of intergenerational war, of the Nakba, the deportation of Palestinians, of just the house arrest of Palestinians, visions of the bleeding land, so very intense politically. Few Palestinian women actually felt the pain of the land. And a lot of times what happened in those visions is that they activate people. So unlike the kind of what we think about the kind of the unitive experience, which is an experience of acceptance, letting go, compassion to all, these experiences, a lot of times they bring this energy of like activism or anger or resistance. And in a way, the action is intertwined with it, the insight is intertwined with action. So they break people from the kind of normal way of perceiving the world. It reveals some injustice, and the action is also kind of almost wants to go out in these moments. So this kind of action intertwined with insight, they have a whole talk about this thing, but basically they kind of almost push people in wanting to change reality around them when insight like this occurred. So if you see things in a new way, or if you see injustice, you also want to change the old way. So a lot of times they even intervene in the ceremony itself, but also they try to, these people who had these revelations try to become like actors or activists, or kind of try to bring change. So this kind of idea of revolutionary revelations is very much, if you think about the archetypical prophet, you know, a prophet is a person who has a vision, but then it's tried to lead a certain movement. So the prophet kind of operates on the kind of stage of history, tries to change society. And psychedelics also have this kind of a prophetic element in them. Okay, so I'll summarize now. And I just want to say that like we need to look at psychedelics from a biopsychosocial perspective. The bio and psychological are obvious for many people, and the kind of the psychedelic neuroscience and psychedelic therapy is a lot about the biological and the psychological. And just a reminder, this talk is just a reminder of the social. It doesn't mean that the psychological and biological are not crucial. It's just like these all things together. And when we think about mental health, we need to think about this whole spectrum of human life. Also, when we think about neuroscientific theories, it's good to incorporate social into the theories. And for example, actually, Rebus incorporates that, right? So Rebus, the idea that the expectations of the world reduces, which gives space for more surprise and more sensory input, more being influenced by the context. So actually, through Rebus, the idea of cultural priors, of suggestibility, of changes that depends on context, are also through this kind of explanation. Also, a few examples of plasticity are all actually also incorporating biopsychosocial, and I kind of think that's why plasticity becomes this kind of main thing right now in psychedelic research. There's a convergence into discussing about plasticity, and mainly because it gives a good neuroscientific explanation for enhanced influence of context. So for example, from the lab of Rachel Yehuda, who studies trauma, there's this, they kind of describe the therapeutic process. Is something similar to critical period plasticity. So if you know with animals, if you know those studies of blocking vision, binocular vision. So if you go to kittens and you block their eyes when they're very young, and then you take those, when they become adults, you take those, the eye masks, and they cannot develop sight anymore. Right? So there was a critical period in which vision is developed, and if that period is blocked, then vision will not develop in their life. So they suggest, Rachel Yehuda, that psychedelics are this kind of plasticity period that allows change, but that change is always context dependent. It depends on what's happened in the therapy, and that allows change. I think that one kind of beautiful example of this plasticity is actually if you see a lot of patients in trials, what they say, and what a lot of times happens to people who go to psychedelic rituals or festivals or therapy is that their musical orientation is changing, right? They start listening to the music that they listened while they listen to other psychedelics. And I think that relates to re-enculturation, okay? Music is our culture, and we get used to listening to certain music, we develop our musical taste, but then we listen to psychedelics under music in a highly plastic state, and we change our musical orientation. And that relates to changes in cultural input, okay? So if we're thinking on enculturation, enculturation is learning. We learn about our social environment. So we can also change these enculturation as we change learning. So human mushroom coevolution. This is kind of a theory that I'll finish with this thing of psychedelic sociality of Michael Winkelmann and Arke. And Winkelmann is like studies of psychedelics from evolutionary perspective for the last 30 years, I think. And they argue this thing. I'm not sure I completely believe that idea, but they suggest that humans and mushroom co-evolved and mushroom helped human evolution. The way they argue that is to show that the effect of psychedelics is very much human. Is a very much human thing. So when you think what psychedelics do, they increase our flexibility, creativity, they change process of enculturation, they bring sociality, there's altruistic behavior, a lot of things, the examples they give here, symbolic behavior, so how we are affected by symbols and narratives and stories, meaning, all of these they argue relates to human sociality, and we developed this skill with the help of mushrooms. So it's a concept of a social cognitive niche. I won't get too much into this, but why I think it's interesting is to just think about it as that the 5-HT2A receptor, whether system and receptor, whether it's developed evolutionary through mushrooms or not, plays a crucial role in culture, sociality, human relationships, and so on. So to think about the 5-HT2A receptors is something which kind of crucial for something that's unique about humans. So we know that all drugs are context dependent. You know, it's not just psychedelics. If you drink alcohol in a bar with friends in a party and dance, or you're just with one friend and kind of crying about something that happens, this is already a different way alcohol it becomes context dependent. And every substance is, but it seems that psychedelics are a bit more than any other substance context dependent, especially if you think about visions and how they change through cultural priors. So based on this, I kind of think that the 5-HT2A receptors are very much related to this something that's unique to humans. So I'll finish with, actually I have time for two things, two speculations, okay? One speculation is about let's actually go to this one first. I have time, right? Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah. So this is kind of a speculation, kind of continuing based on what I said right now. So it's a kind of a neuroevolutionary, neuroanthropological speculation about the 5-HT2A system. We see that the distribution of the 5-HT2A receptor, I promised some neuroscience, so I have to do those slides. We see that the 5-HT2 receptor is in high-level regions, in like kind of the highest parts of the hierarchy, and frontoparietal regions, DMN, kind of transmodal regions. But we also see that there's high density in the primary visual cortex. Okay, you see this here in the back of the brain. So not in all primary sensory modalities, but high density in the primary visual cortex. We also know that psychedelics are very visual. We know that they reduce alpha power frequency. So usually alpha power frequency in EEG is something that's reliably reduced whenever people open their eyes. So moving from eyes closed to eyes open reduces the alpha power. Also psychedelics, if you're with eyes closed and you take LSD, DMT, there's a reduction in alpha power. This suggests that there's activation in the visual cortex. So here, and it's the most replicated results in psychedelic research, like undeniably, there's a reduction in alpha power in dozens of studies from the 50s and 60s, and also the kind of modern studies. For example, we see in a DMT injection, we see in the Chris Timmerman study, this is the intensity of DMT, subjective intensity, and we see here this band of alpha power reduces immediately in the beginning because it's an immediate reaction. But once the response goes down, we see also that the alpha power kind of comes back, okay? Suggesting that there's activity in the visual cortex. Also here with bold studies, we see activation under ayahuasca, we see activation in the visual cortex with bold, measuring with bold. So kind of looking at eyes closed, eyes open in a block design, looking at the activity in the visual cortex and showing that people are with eyes closed, there is still activity in the visual cortex, while it's usually when we close our eyes, it drops the activity. With ayahuasca, when we close our eyes, the activity stays in the primary visual cortex. Now, so this is activation. Now we look at connectivity. So we see that, and this is kind of what I'm going to suggest now, that a lot of the kind of meaning enhancing things behind psychedelics are related to vision, and they're sensory. They are sensory. So, for example, the idea of like stories become visions, their cultural priors become visions, or our connection to our surrounding a lot of times has a visual component into it. Okay, things are enhanced, things are moving, things are alive, but there's a visual component to it. And I argue that this is because that 5-HT2 system is related to both high-level regions in the kind of transmodal regions, but also to the primary visual cortex. And actually, if you look at it a lot, neuroscientific studies, we see connectivity increases between the primary visual cortex. So here, this is a between network analysis, and we look at co-fluctuation of regions, so how they operate together. And visual cortex, primary visual cortex, operate with many higher level vision regions. And we see this also in our PNAS paper. So connectivity in the primary visual cortex becomes more connected to many other regions. And Also other studies from Preller Lab in Switzerland, from Zurich, and the Liechti lab, so Muller in Basel, and the lab in Amsterdam. Sorry, not in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. They also showed this connectivity between primary visual regions and higher level regions, frontoparietal or DMN. Enzo also showed it with our data. So what I argue here is that these regions, which have high 5-HT2A receptors, they operate together, and they bring stories into visions. They create in a sensory way, and that's enhanced the meaning of stories, and that brings a certain way of being in the world, an altered state that has a function for humans through rituals, through religiosity, through enhancing meaning in different through different practices, and probably serve the function in our evolutionary advantage for culture and acculturation and sociality. So this is a suggestion and theory I'm developing. It might be flawed. Another speculation is regarding psychedelic therapy. So just kind of thinking about how psychedelic therapy would be in the future, hopefully how it will be in the future, is hopefully a hybrid between a clinic and a community center. This is, first of all, cost effective. Working with groups is cost effective, obviously. Hopefully this will be local, so not a retreat that people go to, connect to some strangers and come back, but also something that creates communities in with your neighbors. It helps in peer support, so there's less neglect. One of the problems of psychedelic trials is once that they build a kind of a strong connection with the therapist, the trial ends, and some people feel neglect after the trial. So if a community is kind of created around the practice, a therapeutic communal practice, then there's no need for necessarily for the relationship with the therapist as the thing that grounds you in the integration. So people can just help each other integrate. It can be diverse. It can be people from different, with different issues, different problems. It doesn't have to be therapeutic. It can be just playing music together and enjoying each other. So people with different skills can contribute to each other. It doesn't have to be everybody are depressed coming together. Hopefully participatory, so means that people engage in this. They don't just receive things from therapists, but they also engage. And knowledge moves through apprenticeship. So knowledge moves from the facilitators into the people that go, the patients, let's say, but then the patient can become a musician or can become a facilitator later on once they're more involved in the practice. So this is obviously how if you know kind of how the underground practices operate, they operate pretty much in this way. And I think this is the organic way in which psychedelics work. Right now, there's a challenge of institutionalizing them, but hopefully this organic way of how to work with psychedelics would also happen in the institutions. Thank you very much to all. Yeah. Maybe I thank Robin Karat-Harris for supervision in 9 years and the whole Center for Psychedelic Research, Michael Wilkelman, Catherine Peller, and Evgenia Fotiu for Psychedelic Sociality research topic we edited together in Frontiers, and for Natalie Ginsburg, Dublin, Antoine Saka, and Nadim Karkabi for the peace research. Thank you.